The wheel hummed, a low, steady vibration that traveled up through the wooden stool and into her spine. Elara pressed her palms into the center of the spinning gray mound. The clay felt cool and slick under her skin, pulling against her grip with heavy, wet resistance. She drew her hands upward, thinning the walls of the bowl. A small, jagged grit caught beneath her thumb, threatening to tear the symmetry of the rim. She did not flinch. She adjusted the pressure of her left hand, smoothed the imperfection with a light, sweeping motion, and forced the clay back into a perfect circle. Around her, the studio remained in shadow, lit only by a single beam of light catching the dust motes in the air. She held her breath, watching the form rise. Her fingers traced the curve, sensing the thickness of the walls, ensuring the balance was exact. The bowl stabilized, spinning in a blur of motion. She slowed the wheel, the whirring fading into the silence of the room, leaving only the sound of her own steady breathing. She pulled her hands away, leaving the clay perfectly centered, a finished form waiting for the heat of the kiln. Elara wiped the wet clay from her hands and moved toward the front of the shop. She unlatched the heavy wooden door, and the sound of the merchant district rushed in like a breaking wave. Outside, vendors shouted prices over the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on stone. Gold coins changed hands with a sharp, metallic ring that cut through the thick air. The shop, Earthly Touch, sat tucked between a boisterous spice merchant and a weaver. Inside, the shelves held rows of bowls and mugs, each piece stripped of excess, their forms defined only by their utility. Outside, the street remained a cacophony of commerce. Passers-by slowed as they approached the storefront, their eyes drawn to the clean silhouettes displayed in the window. A woman stopped, pointed at a tall, slender vase, and tapped on the glass. Then, a second person joined her. Then, a third. A line began to snake down the narrow cobblestone path, blocking the entrance to the neighboring stall. Elara stepped onto the threshold, watching the crowd grow. She looked at the simple, unadorned shapes on her shelves, and then at the faces of the people pressing toward her door. The morning heat began to rise from the pavement, carrying the scent of dust and spices. Across the narrow street, Silas stood in the shadow of his own doorway. He did not look at his own wares. His eyes remained fixed on the line of people stretching from the entrance of Earthly Touch. He watched a woman pause in front of his stall, glance at his display, and then turn her back to walk toward Elara's shop. Silas shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the uneven stone. He reached into his pocket and gripped his heavy coin purse. The leather creaked under the pressure of his fingers, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed the metal inside. He stepped forward, then stopped, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line. The noise of the market seemed to dull, replaced by the rhythmic thud of his own pulse against his throat. He watched the crowd grow, each new arrival cutting into the potential profit he had counted on for the season. He pulled his purse tighter, the weight of the coins digging into his palm. His breathing shortened, becoming shallow and quick. He stared at the shop door, his gaze tracking every customer who entered and left with a wrapped parcel. The discrepancy between his empty space and her thriving business was a physical weight he could not set down. Silas turned his back on the street and retreated into the dark interior of his shop. The air inside felt stale, heavy with the scent of stagnant dust. He paced the length of his counter, his boots clicking sharply on the floorboards. Beside him, his assistant stood frozen, eyes averted. Silas stopped, grabbed a heavy, overly decorated vase from the shelf, and shoved it toward the assistant. He gestured to the rows of similar, unsold items that cluttered every surface. "Look at this," he growled, his voice low and jagged. He slammed the vase down, the sound echoing against the walls. He walked to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter to watch the bustling line across the way. He gripped the edge of the frame until his fingertips bled. He turned back, his face hard and devoid of warmth. "The market is shifting, and she is the reason," he stated, his eyes fixed on the assistant. He paced again, his movements stiff and predatory. "She has to disappear." He stood still for a long moment, the silence of his shop amplifying the intensity of his words. He reached for a ledger, his hand trembling with resolve, and prepared to begin his work. The morning sun cut through the studio, illuminating the dust motes dancing over the storage bins. Elara walked to the corner, her hands ready to begin the day, and flipped the heavy wooden lid of the primary bin. She reached down, expecting the cool, supple resistance of premium clay. Instead, her fingers sank into a handful of gritty, gray silt. It crumbled through her grip like dry sand. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped back. She scanned the bin again, plunging her arms deeper, but found only the same useless, coarse earth. She moved to the side table, grabbing the parchment manifest that should have detailed the week's delivery. She shook it, held it up to the light, and turned it over. The surface was perfectly blank. No ink, no signature, no record of the shipment that had arrived only yesterday. She checked the seal on the door, then the locked latch of the bin. Everything was intact, yet the essential core of her work had evaporated. She leaned against the rough brick wall, her breath hitching in the sudden silence of the room. The inventory was gone, and with it, the path forward for the day's production. Elara did not wait for the sun to rise higher. She grabbed a rusted iron shovel from the shed, the metal cold and biting against her palm. She marched toward the riverbank, her boots sinking into the marshy perimeter. The air here was damp, smelling of rot and wet stones. She dropped to her knees, driving the blade into the embankment. The ground was stubborn, packed with river-worn pebbles that deflected her initial strikes. She grunted, shifting her weight, and slammed the shovel down again. The impact jarred her shoulders. She discarded the tool, turning to the earth with her bare hands. She clawed at the wet, heavy silt, pulling away layers of debris and dense river clay. She dug deeper, ignoring the sharp edges of rocks that scraped her knuckles. A thin, dark line of blood appeared at the base of her fingernails, staining the gray mud as she worked. She ignored the sting. Her breathing grew shallow and ragged. She scooped handfuls of the raw material into a burlap sack, her movements frantic and precise. The bank began to collapse around her, but she kept pulling, her hands raw and trembling, refusing to leave until she had enough raw earth to sustain her work. Back in the studio, the lantern flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the workbench. Elara dumped the burlap sack, the damp earth hitting the table with a heavy, wet thud. She began the process, breaking down the river silt with a heavy stone mortar. Her arms burned with every rotation. She added crushed minerals, feeling the grit grind against the pestle, and poured in water a drop at a time. The mixture was too thin, sliding off the table like sludge. She bit her lip and reached for a bowl of pulverized limestone, folding it into the paste with frantic rhythmic motions. Her shoulders locked in a tight, throbbing ache. She ignored the fatigue, pressing her entire body weight into the mix, forcing the disparate elements to bind. The paste thickened, turning a deep, rich gray. She kneaded it with her palms, feeling the resistance shift as the materials finally homogenized. She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of gray silt behind. Hours bled into one another. The only sounds in the room were the scraping of the stone and the ragged rhythm of her own breathing. She kept working, her hands swollen and stiff, refusing to let the pace falter until the batch was perfectly smooth. The final rotation of the mortar echoed in the silent room. Elara stopped, her chest rising and falling in deep, measured gasps. She slid her palms across the surface of the clay, testing its elasticity. It was cool, dense, and yielded to her touch with a subtle, earthy resistance. She pulled a small portion away, rolling it into a thin coil between her fingers. A sharp, granular resistance stalled her movement. A single jagged piece of sediment remained hidden in the fold. She cursed softly, flicking the grit away, and folded the clay back onto itself. She pressed her thumbs deep into the center, kneading with surgical precision until the texture was uniform. She held the mass up to the dim light. It held its shape, firm and pliable. Her reflection caught in the window showed a face etched with deep fatigue, but her eyes fixed on the clay, bright and unwavering. She placed the ball on the center of her wheel. It sat perfectly balanced. She tapped the wood, and the wheel began to spin. The material did not wobble. It did not tear. It turned with a smooth, silent grace that felt entirely new. She stood back, a faint line of a smile breaking the tension in her jaw. The work was ready. Silas walked to the center of the marketplace, his pace measured and deliberate. He pulled a bundle of coarse, ink-stained paper from his bag. He stepped toward a group of shoppers and thrust a flyer into their hands. "Read it," he said, pointing to the bold, jagged lettering. "Toxic glazes. Poison in your kitchen." The shoppers stopped, their eyes scanning the words. One man frowned, holding the paper up to the sunlight, then looked toward the shop window of earthly touch. Silas moved to the next group, his movements frantic and purposeful. He slapped flyers onto wooden stalls and shoved them into the palms of passing merchants. The marketplace began to hum with a new, sharper tone. Conversations died out, replaced by sharp whispers and suspicious glances. People clustered together, their backs turned toward Elara's studio. The air grew heavy with accusations. A woman held a bowl she had bought just days ago, turning it over in her hands as if checking for cracks, her brow furrowed in doubt. The crowd thickened, circling the entrance to the shop. Silas stood at the edge of the square, watching the mounting hostility with a tight, unyielding expression. The atmosphere had shifted. The trust that once defined the street was dissolving into fear. The volume in the square climbed. Voices overlapped, sharp and jagged, cutting through the morning calm. A man shouted, pointing a finger directly at the shop window. He threw a scrap of paper onto the stones, and the crowd surged forward, pressing against the storefront. Silas retreated, blending into the shadows of a nearby archway, his eyes fixed on the door. Inside, Elara heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the wood and the rhythmic thud of fists against her display table. She did not hesitate. She wiped her palms on her apron, pushed the door open, and stepped into the blinding glare of the morning sun. The noise died instantly, replaced by a wall of heavy, expectant silence. She did not stop at the doorway. She moved forward, her boots clicking against the cobblestones, walking until she reached the very center of the circle. The crowd parted, then closed in behind her. She stood still, her gaze scanning the faces of those who had once been her most loyal patrons. They were no longer looking at her work. They were looking at her, their expressions hard, suspicious, and waiting for a reaction. She took a breath, held it, and turned to face the accusers. Elara did not speak. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single unglazed bowl. She held it at shoulder height, her grip firm, her eyes locked on the man who had shouted the loudest. She did not throw it. She let it drop. The bowl hit the stone floor with a sharp, heavy thud. It did not shatter. It bounced once, twice, and then spun in a tight circle, emitting a clear, ringing chime that vibrated across the square. The crowd recoiled, then leaned in. The bowl remained perfectly intact, its edges smooth and unchipped against the rough, unforgiving cobbles. A woman in the front row gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The man who had been pointing at the shop lowered his arm, his fingers trembling. Elara stepped forward and retrieved the bowl, turning it over to show the base. No cracks, no splinters. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer fueled by anger. It was the silence of realization. The accusations of toxicity dissolved in the face of the object's undeniable physical integrity. The crowd shifted, eyes moving from the bowl to Elara, then back to the empty space where the rumors had lived. The tension broke, replaced by a sudden, collective shift in posture as the people realized the truth. The day of the Artisans Guild contest arrived with a heavy, humid heat. The town square was already packed, but the center lane remained clear, awaiting the final entries. A low rumble of wooden wheels against stone announced the arrival of the first caravan. It was not a cart, but a massive, custom-built carriage pulled by two heavy draft horses. Silas sat atop the driver's bench, his posture rigid. Behind him, the carriage was piled high with statues. Each piece was coated in thick, shimmering gold leaf that caught the morning light and threw blinding flares across the square. 4 servants marched beside the carriage, their backs bent at sharp angles, faces slick with sweat as they struggled to maintain the balance of the heavy, ornate load. Silas signaled for a halt, and the carriage lurched to a stop with a metallic groan. He hopped down, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharp, dismissive glare. He gestured for the servants to unload the statues, directing them to place the largest pieces at the front of the guild hall entrance. Every movement was calculated to draw eyes, to overwhelm the space with shine and size. He watched the onlookers retreat, forced back by the sheer volume of his display. He stood amidst his golden hoard, arms crossed, waiting for the judges to appear. A path opened through the crowd, but it was not for a carriage. Elara walked toward the Guildhall entrance on foot. She carried nothing but a small, plain wooden crate braced against her hip. Her pace was steady, rhythmic, and entirely unhurried. The onlookers watched, their heads tilting in confusion as they scanned for the rest of her exhibit. There were no servants. There were no draft horses. There was only the faint sound of her boots clicking against the uneven pavement. As she reached the stone table, she paused. The surface was already crowded with the reflection of Silas's gilded statues, which cast long, sharp highlights across the floor. Elara set her crate down. The impact was soft, a dull thud that barely registered against the backdrop of the noisy square. She stood for a moment, her hands resting on the rough edges of the wood, catching her breath. Silas turned from his display, his gaze dropping to the small box, then up to her face. He scoffed, gesturing toward his own towering collection with a sweep of his arm. The crowd pressed in, forming a dense circle around the table. The contrast was absolute. Where Silas had filled the air with glare and bulk, Elara occupied only the space she needed. She took a deep breath, looked toward the guild judges, and waited for the signal to begin. Elara began to work. She pulled the lid from her crate, the wood scraping softly against the stone table. Her fingers moved with deliberate care, peeling away layers of protective cloth. She lifted the first piece, a bowl, and set it down. It did not catch the light like the gold nearby. It drank it in. The surface was a deep, rich ochre that seemed to pulse with the warmth of sun-baked earth. A hush rippled through the onlookers, the constant murmur of the crowd faltering as they leaned closer. She moved to the second piece, a mug, and placed it beside the bowl. Its color was a dark, mineral-infused slate, streaked with veins of burnt umber. Finally, she produced the vase, its surface a complex swirling gradient of forest green and peat. The three items sat in a tight formation, their muted, natural tones creating an anchor of stillness in the middle of the chaotic square. The judges stepped forward, their eyes drawn away from the blinding glare of the statues. The light from the hall hit the pottery, revealing subtle textures that seemed to shift as the crowd moved. Every spectator was now locked on the table, the sheer, grounded intensity of the pieces silencing the surrounding noise. Elara stepped back, her hands resting at her sides, letting the work speak for itself. The hall fell into a state of absolute stillness. The lead judge stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing against the floorboards. He was a man of precise movements, his eyes flicking between the two opposing displays. He paused at the center line, the threshold between the gold-leafed statues and the simple earthen bowls. The crowd held its breath, the silence stretching thin. Silas stood tall, his chin lifted, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He did not look at Elara. He stared straight ahead at the judge, his chest rising and falling in rhythmic, forced breaths. The judge lingered at the divide, his gaze sweeping over the expansive, brilliant glare of the gilded collection. He seemed to weigh the sheer scale of the statues against the quiet presence of the pottery. Then, with a slow, measured nod, he turned his back on the crate. He stepped toward the golden display, the metal surfaces casting flickering light across his face. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches above a large, ornate vase. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the weight of the upcoming inspection. Silas shifted his weight, his posture rigid as he watched the judge prepare to touch the work. The judge adjusted his grip, his expression unreadable, as the final moment of anticipation reached its peak. The judge extended his hand. He did not rush. He tapped his fingernail against the side of the gilded vase, a soundless, expectant motion. Then, he applied a fraction more pressure. A sharp, high-pitched fracture cut through the room like a whip. A thin, jagged line bloomed across the surface of the gold leaf. The judge paused, his eyes narrowing as he traced the fissure. He pressed again, deliberately. The vase gave way. A spider web of cracks splintered across the form, and a large shard of the interior material detached, clattering onto the stone floor. The sound was hollow and tinny, utterly devoid of substance. The hall erupted in a low, collective murmur. Silas froze, his face draining of color as he stared at the ruin of his display. The judge pulled his hand back, his expression shifting from curiosity to open disdain. He turned away from the shattered gold, ignoring the debris at his feet. The failure was absolute, resonant, and undeniable. Every eye in the room shifted toward the remaining display, leaving Silas standing in the shadow of his own broken work. He tried to speak, but the sound of the cracking ceramics still seemed to vibrate in the air, drowning out any defense he could offer. The judge stepped over the debris of the shattered gold and approached the small wooden crate. He did not look back at the broken shards. He reached for the mug, his fingers wrapping firmly around the handle. He lifted it, testing the balance, and brought it closer to his face. He rotated the piece slowly, his thumb tracing the smooth, cool surface. He turned the mug over. Exposing the base to the light, he scrutinized the finish, checking the consistency of the firing and the integrity of the clay. He held it there for a long, quiet moment, measuring the craftsmanship against his own high standards. Then, he looked up. He caught the eyes of the other judges standing nearby and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The tension that had gripped the hall finally broke. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as they pressed closer to see the work. The judge set the mug back down with a soft, steady click, his expression shifting into one of clear approval. Elara watched from the side, her breath hitching as the weight of the moment settled in. The validation was absolute. Her work had spoken for itself, and the judges had heard it loud and clear. The head judge moved to the final piece on the table. He reached out, his hands steady, and wrapped his fingers around the neck of the vase. He lifted it slowly, testing the weight, then raised it high above his head for the entire hall to witness. The sunlight filtered through the high windows, striking the deep, rich colors of the surface and making them glow with a warm, earthy intensity. He held it there, letting the silence command the attention of every person in the room. He turned to the crowd, his face set in an expression of firm resolve. He pointed toward the table and then toward Elara, clearly identifying the winner of the contest. The room erupted in applause, the sound bouncing off the high stone walls. Silas stood at the edge of the circle, his hands trembling at his sides. He watched the light catch the vase one last time before his gaze dropped to the floor. He turned on his heel, his shoulders hunched, and pushed his way through the gathering crowd. He retreated into the back of the hall, slipping into the dark corners where the shadows swallowed his form. He was gone before the final cheers had faded, leaving the space entirely to the success of the work on the pedestal. The contest hall doors swung open, spilling the crowd back into the merchant district. By the time Elara returned to her shop, the street was already thick with people. They moved in waves, pushing toward the storefront, their voices rising in a constant, demanding hum. She unlocked the heavy wooden door, but the pressure of the crowd forced it open before she could step aside. Within minutes, the shelves were stripped bare. Hands reached for the remaining mugs, the bowls, and the final vases, until nothing remained but dust on the wood. She stood behind the counter, watching the coins pile up, the weight of the metal growing heavier with every transaction. Outside, the line stretched down the block and around the corner, a sea of faces waiting for a piece of her craft. The merchants who once ignored her shop now stood at the back of the queue, watching the steady flow of trade. She closed the register, the lock clicking into place with a sharp final sound. The inventory was gone, yet the demand did not wane. She stepped to the doorway, looking out at the street. The air was filled with the sound of her name being passed from one person to the next. The shop was empty of product, but the path ahead was clear. The heavy door clicked shut, muffling the chaotic hum of the street. Elara exhaled, the sound thin against the sudden stillness of the studio. She moved to the center of the room, her boots steady on the floorboards. She reached for a fresh lump of raw earth, its texture cool and firm between her palms. She dropped it onto the center of the wheel. Her foot found the pedal, and the wood began to spin, slow at first, then gaining a steady hypnotic momentum. She leaned forward, her shoulders dropping, and pressed her hands into the yielding mass. The clay rose, wobbling for a heartbeat before her fingers guided it into a perfectly centered pillar. The whirring of the wheel filled the air, a constant, grounding vibration that pushed away the echoes of the marketplace. She ignored the muffled shouting outside, focusing entirely on the wet, spinning surface beneath her thumbs. The resistance of the earth against her skin felt like a conversation. She smoothed the walls of the rising form, her breathing slowing to match the rotation of the wheel. The world outside remained, but here, in the dim light, the rhythm was all that mattered. She closed her eyes, her hands working in perfect synchronization with the spinning base, and began the work again.